Good morning. Good morning. My name's Owen. I'm one of the pastors on staff, and I just want to extend a special welcome to our Neepawa campus joining us online this week. So, when I graduated, I took part in the time-honored Canadian tradition of taking a year off of school to work at Timmy's. Now, in late November of that year, my brother-in-law asked me if I wanted to go snowboarding with him. At the time, I was more into snowboarding than I am now, especially having recently moved to the Prairies. But I was like, yeah, absolutely. But there was a couple ducks I needed to get in the row. One, I needed to get the time off of work. And two, I needed a new snowboard because my board was about a foot too short and wasn't going to suffice for the mountain we had picked out to go to. So first, get the time off. At that time, we had a pretty solid team at Timmy's, if you can call it that. But we had a good crew. And so I was like, you know what? It'll be fine. Our manager's really good at this. She'll get me the time off, no problem. So I go and talk to her, and I'm like, hey, I want to go snowboarding with my brother-in-law, spend some good time with him. And she just looks me dead in the eye and is just, no. And so Owen at 18 was a little more passive than I am now, so just be prepared for that. I didn't do anything about this whatsoever. I just kind of was like, okay. Internally, I was really frustrated because she'd done this before and I didn't get why she wasn't doing it now. Externally, I just kind of, okay, and walked away. So I was like, all right, plan B. Instead of just getting the time off, I'll talk to one of my coworkers and get them to swap shifts for me. We did it all the time. Some of my coworkers at the time were like my best friends in the world. So I was like, surely somebody will cover this for me. And so I talked to person after person, and some of my closest friends did the same thing. They were like, no. But then other people were willing to cover it, but we had to get all of these switches approved by the manager. So every single person that I found that would cover my shift would take it to the manager and be like, hey, we're going to switch this shift for this shift. She would look at me dead in the eye and go, no. Again, externally, I'm like, oh, okay. Internally, I'm like, what is wrong with you? Like, we do this all the time. We're constantly, like, we have the schedule set, but we're constantly changing it and swapping shifts and stuff, and I didn't understand what was going on and why this woman was trying to ruin my life. Eventually, I did find somebody that was willing to cover my shift and keep it a secret from our boss. It was actually her son. And I also had to pay him $20 on top of taking my shift. I was really committed to this snowboard trip. But I got the shift covered, and we're good, right? So then, next step, I need to get the new board. So late November, it was just after my birthday, I had a bit of money that my grandparents had given me for my birthday because they're always good for that. And I just needed a little bit more from my paycheck to kind of top me up to get the right amount for my snowboard. So, and it worked out perfectly because it was like payday was Friday, we're going the following week, midweek snowboarding, so I'd have time to get the board, get it set up, and away we go. It was going to be great. So Friday, I go to pick up my check, and I go to the little slot where our boss put all our checks. We had the paper checks that are like kind of sealed, and you have to rip off the end and open them up. And so I'm pulling them out, and I rifle through, and I don't see my name. I'm a little confused. I'm like, this is weird. So I go through again, nothing. I'm like, and these are, again, they're little printed things, so I'm not like misreading anything here. And I go through one more time, I'm like, it's not here. And at this point, I'm just fuming and enraged. I'm like, what is going on? And so I storm into my boss's office, and I'm like, excuse me. I noticed my check is missing. Do you know? And she's like, oh, yeah, sorry, Owen. There was an accounting error. You're not getting this check. You're going to have to wait. Like 2-3 weeks minimum. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. And walk away. Internally, I'm just like losing my mind. I'm like, are you kidding me? First, you're just stopping this trip at every chance you get, and then you don't pay me for the work that I've already done? I'm just livid. Like, again, externally, couldn't tell. Internally, I'm ready to walk out and quit in that moment. I was so frustrated. I was angry. I felt personally hurt by this. It was so frustrating. You can imagine then my surprise when about a month later, Christmas morning, I get up, go to the tree with my family, and there tucked in behind the tree is a present that's wrapped that is very clearly a snowboard. And as I got closer to the snowboard, taped on the outside of the wrapping paper was my check. So if you haven't pieced it together yet, my parents had bought me a snowboard for Christmas, and so my mom had been conspiring all along with my boss to keep me from ruining my Christmas present. So it was great in the end. In that moment, though, before I knew that Christmas was coming, I was incredibly frustrated. I was super angry, and I was offended by my boss. She was the devil incarnate to me in that moment. If I had only known, right? But the truth of it is that the expectations I had on my boss, the expectations of what I wanted to happen in my life, were not lining up with reality. And so that left me offended. I was frustrated, I was hurt, and I was angry. And so often in our lives, when our expectations don't line up with our reality, we become offended. Right? We might use different words for it. We might use words like frustrated. We might use words like angry. We might use words like hurt, but we are offended. Right? So like that raise that your boss has promised you for years that just keeps getting put off and put off and put off, you get kind of frustrated. And the offense builds, and it builds a gap between you and your boss, right? Or like, you needed a really good harvest this year to clear some debt and make a way forward for your family, and then you get a year like this where it's like, I don't know what's going to happen. We'll see. And you can get really angry in those moments that things aren't working out the way you had planned. Or like your spouse has promised to take a job so that they'll be closer to home and not be gone so often, but instead, they take a promotion that ends up leaving them on the road for 3 out of 4 weeks of the year, of the month. And you're deeply hurt. And that causes the offense that then builds this gap in your relationships. But even more, we feel it with God. Even more, when our expectations on God aren't met by them, we are offended by Him, right? When we have a promise that we feel we've received from God and He doesn't make that promise, it offends us, it hurts us, it frustrates us, it makes us angry. Like, you have felt like God has something for you that is important to do in His kingdom, and other people have spoken this over you. There's this promise on your life, and yet nothing ever happens. And you're like, okay, God, what? When? You get frustrated. Or you're drowning in debt and you're paycheck to paycheck, and you're like, hey, God, I really need a financial miracle here so that you can deal with this so that I can live fully in freedom and generosity. And I've seen you do it with these other people. I've seen you come through miraculously for my friends, and I need it now. And nothing. Or maybe you're living with a chronic illness that you have suffered from for years. And you have been faithful, and you have trusted, and you have prayed and prayed and prayed for healing for yourself, and you've prayed for healing for other people, and you've seen them healed, you've seen them set free, and you're like, okay, Jesus, this is it. I trust you. I have faith that you want to do this for me, that this is something that you want from my life. So come, Jesus, heal me. And nothing. In those moments, we become offended by God. It hurts. We're frustrated and we're angry, and it doesn't make sense. So what do you do when your expectations on God don't match up with reality? We're in this series, Uncluttered, where we're working through the book of Mark, and we're looking at the chaos of our lives, and we're seeing the way that Jesus brings order to that chaos. And we're going to continue looking at that this morning in Mark chapter 8. We're going to start in verse 14. So let's read this together. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. So a little bit of context coming into these verses. So Jesus and the disciples had just been coming from a confrontation with the Pharisees. So they had had this confrontation with the teachers of the law, where they had challenged Jesus to give a miracle to prove who he said he was. So that's exactly the moment they're coming off. They're going onto the boat, getting away from that. And so Jesus is kind of continuing the teaching. He's debriefing with his disciples, and he says, watch out for the yeast of Herod and the Pharisees. Meanwhile, they're stuck on some bread. But there's some important things here in the yeast of Herod and the yeast of Pharisees that we want to talk about. The yeast of Herod, I would encourage you to go on YouTube, find Prairie Alliance Church, and go back a few weeks and find Pastor Nathan's sermon where he talks about the yeast of Herod, because he goes in way more detail than we're going to today. But at the core of the yeast of Herod, there is a desire for comfort, there's a desire for opulence, and there's a desire for pleasure. That's kind of the core of the idea of yeast of Herod that Jesus is talking about. And then when it comes to the yeast of the Pharisees, this is at the heart of it, this is a desire to control God. It's a desire to kind of earn our own salvation, to make our own way, to make our God our own. The language we use around PAC very often to describe this is we describe this as a religious spirit. All right, so we continue in verse 16. They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. Totally missing the point. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? Jesus is frustrated with his disciples, as he often gets in the book of Mark, because they're just not getting it. They're so focused on their physical need in that moment that they're entirely missing out on the spiritual reality he's trying to teach them about. They're so focused, they're like, oh shoot, we forgot bread. And Jesus is like, do you not get it yet? You remember, I fed you already once before. I fed thousands and thousands of people out of nothing, and you're concerned about bread? Come on, guys. Jesus is frustrated with them. And how often do we fall into that same boat where we are so focused on our physical needs, on what is right in front of us, that we miss what it is that Jesus is doing and what he's trying to teach us? Let's keep going. In verse 22. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, don't even go into the village. So this is a really unique healing story. There's a few things going on here. So first, it's unique in that Jesus leads this man away from the town, away from the crowds to heal him. Very often in the Gospels, we'll see that Jesus will just heal people on the spot in the middle of the crowds as a sign of his might and power. But in this case, he leads the man away from all of that. The second unique thing here is that he actually takes this man by the hand, presumably because he is blind, but takes him by the hand and leads him out. And it's unique in that more often than not, when Jesus touched someone, they were healed. When people just touched the skirt of his robe, they were healed. With Jesus, most of the time, it's one-touch healing. This time, Jesus takes him by the hand and leads him somewhere. And then the most unique piece of this whole story, this is the only time in the entire Bible where Jesus prays for healing for someone twice. Everywhere else, it's one touch and they're healed. This time, he lays hands on him and prays twice. And we don't really know why. It's really tempting and easy to look for answers, but there really isn't one. It's really easy to kind of be like, okay, so maybe this blind man, maybe he had a lack of faith, or maybe the spit was therapeutic or something, which is really gross when you think about it. But no, there's no real reason here that we understand. But we can see that Jesus didn't stop praying for this man until he was healed. He didn't stop until there was breakthrough. And so as we follow Jesus, we don't stop until there is breakthrough. When the healing doesn't come, we don't give up. When we don't receive the miracle, we don't stop seeking Jesus. And when our prayers are met with disappointment, we will not lose hope. Amen. He hasn't given up, and neither will we. Let's keep going in verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. So this is a watershed moment in the story of Jesus. From this point on, everything changes. Prior to this moment in the book of Mark, Jesus is kind of cryptic and hidden. He speaks in parables a lot of the time. And after this, he becomes way more direct. He becomes way more blunt. And he becomes way more confrontational in his authority. This is a watershed moment for Jesus. And for us, it is a watershed moment. This question, "Who do you say I am?" is a watershed moment in your life. Because your answer to this question determines everything from this point going forward. And it's really easy, like the disciples, to go back and fall back on someone else's answer, right? It's really easy to be like, well, okay, so my parents said that Jesus was like this. Or this scholar in this book that I read this one time said this about Jesus. Or actually, this podcast that I listened to, which is really great, you should really listen to it, they say this about Jesus. It's really easy to give someone else's answer, but Jesus doesn't give room for that. He wants your answer. Who do you say I am? And the answer to that question determines everything from this point forward in your life. So verse 31, he then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But then Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, and he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." So Jesus, he gets really specific about what the Messiah is, right? Peter's like, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus is like, "Okay, great. Here's what it means." And he paints this picture that we find in Isaiah chapter 53 that we call the suffering servant. He says, this is what it really means to be Messiah. And Peter, his expectation of Jesus was that of a militaristic king. His expectation of Jesus was that as Messiah, he was going to come, he was going to lead a military conquest, and he was going to free the Jews from Roman rule and reign. That was his expectation. And a rejected Messiah, a suffering servant, it was incompatible with Jewish conviction and hope at the time. And so Peter rejects that, and he rebukes Jesus. And Jesus in turn rebukes Peter for that. More harshly than he rebukes any Pharisee, he says, "Get behind me, Satan. What you're saying is not God's thoughts. Those are human thoughts." He's saying to Peter, this box that you have constructed of expectation, that is not me. I have the bigger picture. I know more than you. I see the whole thing. This box you have made, it's not the whole thing. Stop it. And he continues in 34. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" Notice in those two verses, 36 and 37, Jesus directly combating the yeast of Herod and the yeast of the Pharisees, right? The yeast of Herod, again, is this desire for opulence, for pleasure, for comfort. And Jesus in 36 says, "What good is it for you to gain the whole world and lose your soul?" He's coming right up against that. And then in verse 37, the yeast of the Pharisees, this desire for control, this desire to earn your salvation, what can you give in exchange for your soul? The answer is nothing. So Jesus is directly combating these ideas. Let's keep going. "And if anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed for them when he comes in his Father's glory and the holy angels. And he said to them, 'Truly I tell you, some of you who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God has come with power.'" So Jesus, again, is painting this picture that it's not just for the select few. This is for every single person who wants to follow Jesus. Our expectation should be of what the picture that Jesus is painting. And so he paints this picture of the suffering servant for everyone who would follow him. So we should expect this. And in this moment, Jesus, he wasn't meeting expectations, right? For us, we kind of have deified the cross. We've put the cross as a symbol of honor for us as Christians. We wear it around our necks. But at the time, in the Roman world, the cross was humiliating. It was disgusting, and so it was like Jesus was saying to these people, shame yourselves. Throw some poo on yourself or something. Like, lower yourself down and then follow me. That's his expectation. The amount of revulsion and disgust you feel should match that. Jesus was not meeting expectations. So what do you do when Jesus doesn't meet your expectations? What do you do when you're disappointed by Jesus? This is the watershed moment. It's in those moments of frustration and hurt and anger and offense that then that question, who do you say I am, becomes very, very important. In the midst of the hurt and the frustration and pain, we need to ask that question. It's really tempting to run to two things. It's tempting to run to the yeast of Herod. It's really tempting to run away from Jesus and find comfort. It's really tempting to run away from Jesus and take pleasure in our stuff, in our relationships, in our money, in our things, and create another God. And it's really tempting to follow in line with the yeast of the Pharisees, to try to control Jesus, to try to fit him inside the box of our experience and our expectation. Because if we can fit him in there, then we know him and it's safe. A really good litmus test for if you're suffering from this is to ask yourself, when was the last time I was surprised by Jesus? In a good or a bad way? And if you haven't been surprised by Jesus for a little while, chances are the yeast of the Pharisees is working in your life. Peter succumbed to this. He tried to rebuke Jesus. He tried to say, no, Jesus, get back inside the box. And Jesus rebuked him for it. But in the moment of suffering, in the moment of offense and hurt and frustration and anger, if we will respond, Jesus, you are Messiah, you are Lord. And I think we can take some comfort from the story of the blind man that was healed. So first, Jesus, he takes this blind man and he leads him to a quiet place away from the crowds to be in his presence. And in the midst of our hurt, he takes our hand, takes us to a quiet place to minister to us. And he will always give a promise, right? It's the spit in the eye. It's not a terribly appealing image, but it's a promise of healing, and even a partial healing, right? The man could see in part, but not fully yet. There will always be hope with Jesus. There will always be a promise of full restoration that is yet to come. And sometimes that doesn't feel terribly pleasant, but there is always hope. And then if we don't receive healing right away, then we come back to that question again and again, who do you say I am? And if we will continue to answer, you are Messiah, you are Lord, you are King of my life, then we just need to press in and wait in his presence. Some of you have been waiting with spit in your eye for a really long time. And some of you have fresh miracles that you have prayed desperately for that have seemed to have passed you over, and you are just aching in that. Don't run away. Don't create another God. Don't try and make a new Jesus. Press in and worship Jesus in the midst of your disappointment, because even when Jesus doesn't meet your expectations, he is still good. He still has good for you. He is still bringing the miracle. Peter expected this military campaign. He expected this king on a throne with a crown, and instead he received a suffering servant. He received eternal life. He received an eternal king that is far better than any earthly king. But he didn't meet Peter's expectations. Instead, he got this suffering servant who sits with us in the midst of the mess and the chaos and the hurt and the anger and the pain. And he says, come with me into my presence. I'll bring you a little bit right now, and more is coming still. So what are you expecting from God this morning? What is aching in your soul right now that you have yet to see? We're going to worship together in a moment, so I'll invite you to stand. And as you stand, I want you to do something with me. I want you to close your eyes and hold out your hands in front of you. And whatever that thing is that the Holy Spirit brought to your mind as we were talking just right now, that thing that is the ache in your soul, I want you to imagine holding that in your hands in front of you. Whether it's a picture of a little box or a picture of the item itself, imagine it in front of you. And as we worship, we're going to release that to Jesus. Let's continue to hold this posture as we worship together.